Hello, I'm Toycat and welcome back to the second channel geography video. This is Evan's series where I talk about geography and the world and stuff. And today I wanted to talk about everyone's favourite multi-nation union, that's right, the European one. And the reason I wanted to talk about the EU today is because a lot of people get really confused still to this day about why the UK shows up on EU maps. Or like, oh, wasn't there a Brexit thing? Is this an old map or something? But the truth is that the UK is leaving the EU. It takes many years. It's a long process because of how big an organisation the EU is. And because of that, there's many years until it will officially leave the EU and officially leave the map. And because a lot of people aren't familiar with this, despite it being a huge media frenzy, I figured I would talk about the countries that have joined the EU because, again, when you look at this map of the EU, you can clearly see there's room for expansion in terms of like, oh, there's some gaps here and there, but they kind of have EU-like agreements. There's some gaps over here, and there's a particularly notable gap over here where 6 countries are just all kind of cut off from the rest, make a weird hole in Europe. So what's the deal with those 6 countries? Are they all strongly anti-Europe? And the answer to that question is not really actually. All of them are trying to join the EU in some form. So if we go look at the Western Balkans, all Macedonia, or the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Kosovo, Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, and Albania are all in some form of trying to join the EU or being recognized as trying to join the EU. They're just all in various stages. Fun fact, Kosovo's officially just a potential candidate. Bosnia is like an applicant that hasn't been responded to. And Albania, the EU is really suspicious of, their democracy. They're monitoring it right now. I don't entirely understand the, deal with their corruption or their government or whatever, but I'm not here today to talk about democratic institutions. Today, I'm here to talk about the EU instead. So I wanted to talk about Serbia because Serbia is the furthest through the process of joining the EU. Again, it's a huge deal because as the EU expands, so does the, amount of work required to join the EU to harmonize, a whole country with that of the 500 million person bloc. And Serbia is fairly far through that, however. Again, they've gone from trying to join, from, forming the agreements to all the EU countries, ratifying that and going through the steps. And now they just have to deal with a 35-step negotiation process. So yeah, there's 35 different chapters they have to go through. Pretty much all of them have made solid progress besides, I believe, it's budgetary provisions and their justice system that isn't quite up to par in Serbia. But once they've gone through all those 35 things, which, by the way, they made another batch of progress just this year, 2018, once all of those steps are finished, then the EU will officially welcome Serbia as the 29th member, which means that, the map will be this instead, and that big gap in the Balkans will get a little bit smaller. In fact, a lot smaller because the largest of the Western Balkan countries will be joining it instead. So yeah, if that does happen, which again, we'll just kind of focus on the if because there's so many amazing, things in Serbia getting to this progress and joining the EU or like trying, because first of all, Serbia and Kosovo, again, maybe you've heard of that disagreement on the internet before, but Serbia is very strongly, committed to the idea that if, joining the EU means recognizing Kosovo, they're not willing to do it. The majority of the population is, in favor vaguely of the EU, or was, but the majority of the population would not join the EU, even though they want to otherwise, if it meant dealing with Kosovo. So they currently have an agreement where they just have to ignore Kosovo, and Kosovo and Serbia have to not impede each other's EU relations, which apparently works out for them and apparently, causes things to go right. So yeah, Serbia minus Kosovo would be joining the EU, however, and and one of the big things people say is like, oh, but Serbia doesn't want to join the EU, so, EU's not going to expand. It's going to get shorter and shorter as less people want to join. But again, the truth is, a lot of people quote this, because it's a easy thing to say, like, oh yeah, EU's on the downfall, because most Serbians don't even want to join at this point, and, you say that about a bunch of countries, but the truth is even though Serbia used to have 80 or 90% of their population wanting to join the EU back in the early 2000s, and you can maybe understand why, because of what went on then. These days, the population is more like 49%. And again, a lot of people quote that 49% statistic as the majority of Serbians do not want to join the EU. But again, I find that to be really misleading wording, because 49% of Serbians want to join the EU. Something like 20% are, against the EU, like they really don't want to join the EU. And another 30%, they say don't know, not sure. So yeah, 2.5 to 1 landslide in favor of people wanting to join the EU. And although that might change over time, and again, with the rise of Euroscepticism, you could easily see that right now at least, and for the foreseeable future, for the next 2 to 7 years, because Serbia's target date to join the EU is 2020, and the EU, at the same time, they announced that their target date was 2025. I imagine that means the EU's date wins out, but basically, yeah, that means that they probably will join the EU, and so that's the thing that's going to be happening in the future. 29th member of the EU, most likely going to be Serbia. So this map will turn into this map right here. However, interesting enough, because 2025 is the EU target date, and again, some of those things get pushed back even further, I kind of want to reference something kind of interesting about this map right here, because this is a map of the EU 28. When, again, this is like maybe a stat nerd thing for me to be interested in, but I think it's really cool that every single point in Europe's history has been denoted as EU, then the number of countries. So it went from EU6 to EU9 to EU10 to EU12 to EU15 to EU25 to EU27 to EU28. Every single one of those numbers, again, I'd go through them again, but all of those numbers denote a time period in the EU's history. And the reason I find that interesting is because for the first time when the UK leaves, we're going to have to go back to a previous number. So there'll be the EU27 from back before Croatia joined, then there's the EU28 for when Croatia has joined, then there's the EU27 again for when the UK has left, and if Serbia joins by itself, which is the current situation, at the same time Montenegro might join, but if Serbia joins the EU by itself in roughly 2025, then we'll have two EU27s and two EU28. And again, to me, as someone who's just like, there's your system, it's gone now, I find that interesting. And maybe you do too, or maybe that's terrible, but yeah, you're like terribly uninteresting. But whatever, Serbia is going to be the 29th member of the EU, but the 28th member of the current EU, probably. Again, things are crazy in the UK, we have no idea what's happening, but it's something that is worth mentioning. So, with that said and out of the way, let's talk about what Serbia joining the EU would mean for Serbia and for the EU, because although there's a lot of other countries that are on the list of maybe you want them to join the EU, more importantly, because Serbia has already lowered a lot of the barriers to make it kind of EU-like. Some big things have happened already, such as visa liberalization is in place, so if you want to go from Serbia to the rest of the EU, or from the rest of the EU to Serbia, you can do so without visa, kind of like it's an EU member already, but after obviously it joins the EU, then if you're from the EU, you can go there much easier, current ease of any state, and if you're not from the EU and you get a Schengen visa, or if you get the visa and that sort of thing, then it will also work in kind of the same way, and therefore Serbia is going to be a more attractive kind of thing. So first of all, Serbia being added to the EU's lump population, it will add about 7 million to the population. Serbia's been shrinking since something like 1990, so their population was about 8 million. Again, even if you exclude Kosovo's leaving, their population's been shrinking. Will probably shrink further, but again, at its joining, 7 million EU citizens, which is actually a tiny proportion of the total, like 1% or so. So the EU will get about 1% bigger. It will gain another fairly medium-sized country, compared to some of their countries, and it will get the 10th largest nation capital with Belgrade. So isn't that wonderful? And therefore, you as someone from the EU or visiting the EU will eventually be able to just, visit Belgrade on your EU-wide trip or whatever. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because it's not often that here on the geography stuff we talk about, some of the tools that make a nation state, such as, big notable sites, or big notable things about a country and the currency, but those are actually two pretty important things for a country. So again, Belgrade is the place where the majority of, the largest proportion of Serbians live, so if we look up a map of Serbian density, you can see Belgrade has most of it, with a tiny bit around Nice, and a tiny bit around Novi Sad. But most Serbians live there, and also most tourists come into Belgrade because it has the major international airport of Nikola Tesla, which, by the way, a guy from there. Again, important part of the kind of nation building of Serbia and the distinct identity that will remain with Serbia. Also a part of Serbia. Again, I find the currency to be interesting, so I'm going to totally claim this as like being related to the nation state, because it really is, right? Like the currency a country has is interesting, and right now at least Serbia has the dinar. So this is a 200 dinar I have right here. I had 600 dinar when I came back from Serbia a couple of months ago, and it was so little, apparently, in real money, in non-Serbian money, I should say, but it was so little that the guy was just like, you'd have to pay me to take that. So I kept my Serbian money, it looks like this, and the reason I find it interesting is because two things. One, it's in both Latin and Cyrillic, and two, it's one of the few notes in the world that does the whole upwards banknote thing, so only on one side and only on a few banknotes, but most of this banknote is this way up. The correct way to hold it this way around is this way, so it's a vertical banknote, because look, 200, there's some other text. The only thing that's not upwards is the serial numbers, which I assume is for technical reasons. But still, the entire thing, the drawing, all the other stuff, it's all facing upwards. So vertical banknotes, they have them in Serbia right now. But the most likely thing they'd have to do, because like I previously mentioned, if the Serbia does decide to join the EU, they're going to have to join under terms, which will make them probably have to join the Euro and probably have to join, Schengen. So Schengen's its whole own thing, not really too big of a deal for them because their neighbours are joining it anyway. But the Euro will become their currency, most likely at some point in the future. And the cool thing about this is if it weren't for Bulgaria joining, then the Euro would have to change to accommodate their Cyrillic alphabet. However, right now, at least, you can see the Euro has 3 writings on there. There's the Euro in Latin, which 6 of the EU member states use. There's Euro in the, or 25, there's Euro in the Greek script, which 2 use if I'm not mistaken, and then there's Euro in the Cyrillic script, which would also be the one for Serbia. So in the same way that when you look at Swiss money, it has 4 languages, Euro has to have 4 separate, writings of Euro, because 4 separate scripts, and one of them would apply to Serbia. Isn't that a fun fact? I think it is. And yeah, let's just talk a little bit about Belgrade, because that is the place most people go to or whatever, and if you're considering going to Serbia, getting that head start on the new EU member, and then I wanted to just talk a little bit about the fact that it's a really interesting city because it's Belgrade was formed on the kind of tri-point in a river. It's got a word when it comes to rivers, but it was formed on this kind of place right here, and because of that, when you cross the river, you kind of get a distinct place. So Belgrade, the main city, let's just call it Old Belgrade, exists right here on this side of the river, and it's kind of a traditional old European city. There's lots of history, there's lots of stuff like that. It's very, beautiful, pretty, all the things that you want from a place. So like, oh, look at this, look how nice it is. It's got castles, it's got, all the sort of stuff that you expect from a generic European old city, because there's castles, whatever. And then if you go to the west of the river, you get a very communist style kind of system where everything's named blocks. Seriously, block 1, block 31, block 30. I never quite understood the naming system, but again, if you ever go on there, would recommend walking through, because I don't know, it's got that kind of sad feeling where you're just like, something bad is happening here. I guess it's like, I don't know, it makes me feel sad, at least. Maybe that's not your own personal experience, but it's very communist. It's block system, huge, just like towers. Again, the copy-paste communist blocks from there. Maybe that's something interesting. You have to go through it to get from the airport to there, at least. And then if you go to the north, you get the suburbs, which have the most infuriating looking, road system in the world. Again, maybe not to drive on, but if you look at it from a map, this is, again, to me, it's just like, why? Who designed this? Who was in charge of this? Because, it just stings a little bit. So there you go. That is Belgrade, the major city in Serbia. There's 2 others, like I said. There's Niš, which is the 3rd biggest, and there's Novi Sad, which is the 2nd biggest. And the reason that Novi Sad is so interesting is because it's part of Voivodina, which is, because, again, the story of Serbia that I wanted to very briefly tell is that even though now it's a neutral country, a lot of and in fact, there was a neutral country while this happened, it's kind of, from the perspective of Serbians, gone smaller and smaller and smaller, because it used to be all of Yugoslavia. These 6 countries, or 7 countries, say it how you will, but Macedonia, maybe Kosovo, Montenegro, Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, were all under the control of kind of Serbia. I mean, it was more complex than that, but and then it went down to minus Slovenia, then it was minus everyone but Montenegro, then it was just Serbia, and then they lost Kosovo too. Serbia's been like a country which has shrunk so much in just the past 30 years, and yeah, in a way, becoming a part of the EU is growing a lot. In a way, it's becoming a small speck in that thing. But one of the interesting things is, in the same way they lost Kosovo as its independent kind of province to the south, to the north they have a very ethnically mixed province called Voivodina. So Voivodina is this area right here, and it's a really intriguing area because it's got 25% of Serbia's population, and the ethnic diversity is so intense. There's 6 official languages that have to be used over here, depending, all official state documentation has to be done in 6 languages, because there are Hungarians there, there's Romanians there, there's Bosnians, there's Croatians, there's Serbians, as you might expect, and there's even a few, Turkish and other, basically, big mixture of people going on with Voivodina, and yeah, it's kind of interesting, and it kind of culminates in Novi Sad. It's worth mentioning that right now, at least, one of the things about Serbia worth bear in mind is that the infrastructure around it isn't amazing. There is one of the European road networks going through it, but if you want to catch a Serbian train, then even though they've got 4 of their biggest cities in a big corridor, 1, 2, 3, 4, they're all directly in front of each other. Trains suck between them, so you have to get a bus on potentially not so great roads, so that will probably change at some point too. And yeah, Serbia, if it joined the EU, it would change the EU, or the EU would change it, and it would change the EU, and it'd probably be mutually beneficial, but I guess the comment section of this video is not going to be about that. It's going to be people raging about, whether the EU should expand at all. But, again, if a country wants to join the EU, and the EU wants to take the country, I think it's a pretty cool thing in general. So, that's all I have to say about Serbia today. I just wanted to let you know about the newest country joining the EU, and in case you're curious about other likely members, Montenegro is very close second to join the EU. Again, they're in NATO as well now. That basically, they'd be a very close second. Might even come at the same time. Countries that are really want to join the EU but probably aren't include include Ukraine. Moldova could be the fastest new member, because if they merge with Romania, then that would count as EU membership. But realistically, yeah, you got a lot of countries around here that want to join the EU that also kind of don't. And yeah, Turkey's been joining the EU for 30 years now or something, but they really are trying to avoid that one too. So yeah, with that said, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Hope you learned something from it. And second, again, you can always, as always, discuss it on Reddit, because I think it's cool to add a new member to the club, personally, but I'd like to know your opinions in the comments down below. But for now, I guess I'll see you all in the next one. Second channel, don't care, goodbye.